We're joined now by Republican Congressman Tony Gonzalez. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
I want to start on the border. That is your district.
Yes.
How do the agents that you represent explain the drop-off in crossings?
I think a large part of it, well, first off, it doesn't have to do with what Joe Biden has done. We're on pace for 1.3 million people to come over illegally. The numbers are down. The explanation is Mexico. A lot of people don't realize Mexico has an election next month for this presidency, 9 governorships, and it's Congress. So in many cases, those that are running on security platforms are keeping the numbers down. But the cartels are like companies. So they're taking a loss in Q1 and Q2 in order to increase volume in Q3 and Q4. So in many ways, this is just Mexico carrying Biden a couple rounds. Now, if Joe Biden wants to secure this thing long term, I think he needs to stop looking at the Senate for a solution and look to the House.
What do you mean by that? What are you proposing?
I think there's opportunities. Look, H.R. 2 is a good start, but just a conversation.
That's a non-starter.
Let's just say a conversation. The president has not had any real conversations with anyone in the House. The Senate, yes, they've sat down, they've had these conversations, but in the House, they've given no oxygen to it. This is a different Congress than in years past. The House is where I believe you start if you truly wanted to solve it. Now, if you want to make it about politics and just blame someone else, then you hold it in the Senate and you say, we're trying, we're doing the best we can. But meanwhile, Americans are dying of fentanyl. The numbers, we're on pace for 1.3 million. It's insane.
Well, there's a lot of policy to get into with you on this and other topics, but I'm going to have to take a break here, so stay with me, and we'll do that on the other side of it. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We return now to our conversation with Texas Republican Tony Gonzalez. Good to have you here in person. You know, Uvalde, Texas, that is your district. 19 kids and 2 adults killed at Robb Elementary some 2 years ago. And that horrible anniversary was this past week. How is your community doing now?
It's still healing. It's still very raw 2 years later. In many cases, you're constantly re-victimized over and over again. The other part of it, too, is a lot has changed, but a lot hasn't changed. Everyone talks about Robb. You know, what happened at Robb. Everyone talks about the new elementary school, Uvalde Elementary School, but there's 9 other schools in Uvalde that in many cases are still in the same situation. Yeah, they put some fencing up, but how do we protect our kids long term? And one of the things that I did, I mean, I'm in the middle of a runoff fighting for my life politically on there. I held a bipartisan school safety caucus where we brought all these different partners together to have discussions on how we fix things. I had the superintendent of Uvalde. I had the new police chief of Uvalde. There's a lot of changes happening in Uvalde. One of the things that came out of that was $10 million for school safety, not just for Robb and Uvalde Elementary School, but all the other elementary schools as well.
So you mentioned that runoff election and in this primary challenger you have faced. That's the 28th. In the initial, you received 45% of the primary vote, just short of that 50% threshold. I want to ask, because last March you were censured by the Texas Republican Party, and you connected that to the votes that you took to help get the bipartisan Safer Communities Act through the Congress. Do you feel that some of the challenges you're facing now are because of the work you did after those school kids were killed?
You know, Margaret, you cannot be afraid to do what you think is right. You're never going to get it perfect, but you have to fight for the things that are important to us. Keeping our kids safe from being murdered from crazy people, that should be important to all of us. It shouldn't just be talking points. We shouldn't just blame someone else. We shouldn't just talk about mental health. We should actually do something about it to keep us safe. The Safer Community Act has prevented over 500 school shootings from happening, but that is only the start. We have to do much, much more. Part of that is, why isn't there a national standard for school safety? Why are all these schools in a silo when it comes to fighting some of these things? And we have to give them the resources. We passed this bill, but a lot of the money has not made it back to the schools. I'm not afraid of that vote. I'm not afraid of this runoff. I ran very hard in order to win this election, and I'll keep delivering for my district.
It sounds like you're saying yes, that vote hurt your prospects. in your district?
I'm in a runoff for a reason. Part of that was that vote. And you know what? I knew it at the time. When somebody comes in, I like to call him the devil. When the devil comes and visits you and says, hey, Tony, you're going to do this or else, and you tell the devil to go pack sand, you better be ready for a fight.
Who's the devil?
The devil has many faces and many names. Okay. And so what ends up happening is there are no more debates in Washington. Everybody is defending positions that are already defined for them. We got to get back to having debates, real conversations that help real people. It can't just be these, this cosplay. It has to be real people doing real things. You started the segment with the Four Country Caucus.
Yes.
It's a great segment of bipartisanship.
You're part of it.
I'm part of it. I'm the co-chair for Four Country Caucus. That almost did not happen. And the reason it didn't happen is because everybody is at each other's throats and nobody wants to be seen with one another, more or less doing things together. It took a member of Congress by the name of Jim Baird. He's one of the last surviving Vietnam veterans serving in Congress. I don't like to share private conversations of members, but he basically told everybody in the caucus, he goes, here's the deal. Someday, somebody is going to be there to honor your memorial, and I hope you take the time to show up. And I tell you what, that hit everyone pretty hard, and everyone set aside our differences and put it together. But this is a bigger thing that's happening. The working together is almost a bad thing in Washington. We got to push back against that. Let's have debates. Let's fix things. Let's solve real problems for real people.
I think a lot of Americans would like to see that. We just showed video there of Jim Barrett. On your point, though, Donald Trump is campaigning, saying he's going to peel back all of Joe Biden's restrictions on guns. There weren't a lot of restrictions on guns in this Safer Community Act, but you're telling Republicans don't repeal this. You're telling Donald Trump don't repeal the work you did.
I'd argue there weren't any restrictions on guns in this bill. This was a mental health bill that got spun as a gun control bill for the different, advocacies so they could campaign against it or campaign for it. What it did do is it provided mental health resources, and it gave background checks to minors. I'm okay with background checks. Americans should be okay with background checks. We have to do more to keep our kids safe in school. My kids go to school with a bulletproof backpack. You should think about sending your kids to school with bulletproof backpacks. It's not fair. It's not the world that we grew up in, but something has to change. And it can't just be words, and it can't just be pointing blame. We have to solve real problems. We have to debate the issue, and we have to solve real problems by bringing money back. One of my community projects, I brought $5 million back to the Northeast Independent School District in San Antonio for a quick reaction force, essentially a SWAT team for the local ISD.
A lot to unpack there, but thank you. We'll be right back, and thank you for your service.
Thank you, Margaret.
A new record number of air travelers are taking to the skies this weekend, according to the TSA. That's despite severe weather in parts of the country. And there will be more extreme weather this summer. The 2024 hurricane season is projected to be busy, according to both U.S. and World Meteorological Organization predictions. We spoke with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg on Friday and began by asking if federal regulations need to change to deal with increased air turbulence.
The reality is the effects of climate change are already upon us in terms of our transportation. We've seen that in the form of everything from heat waves that shouldn't statistically even be possible, threatening to melt the cables of transit systems in the Pacific Northwest, to hurricane seasons becoming more and more extreme, and indications that turbulence is up by about 15%. That means assessing anything and everything that we can do about it.
Here in the U.S.?
Well, in the atmosphere generally. But certainly something that will affect American travelers, whether here or abroad. Now, there are protocols and patterns for things like how pilots who encounter turbulence can notify those who might be coming in the path. But I do think we need to continually reevaluate that in the face of the reality that these things are more frequent and more severe than before.
That horrific video that people were terrified by when they saw the Singapore Airlines encounter such severe turbulence that actually killed someone. Yep. That was rare. But you're saying you do expect to see more incidents like that here in the U.S.?
To be clear, something that extreme is very rare, but turbulence can happen, and sometimes it can happen unexpectedly. Our climate is evolving. Our policies and our technology and our infrastructure have to evolve accordingly too. This is all about making sure that we stay ahead of the curve, keeping aviation as safe as it is. It's not for nothing that it became the safest form of travel in America.
Boeing released a report that said they saw a 500% increase in the number of employee submissions about safety concerns during the first 2 months of 2024. This is, of course, after all these high-profile incidents that happened with that plane door just flying off. It's good employees are seeing something and saying something, but a 500% increase, I mean, that would suggest that there are actual issues here.
That's right. There's an encouraging part and a concerning part. The encouraging part is we want Boeing and any producer in the aviation space to have a culture of, if you see something, say something. We want to make sure those mechanisms for reporting work. We have both whistleblower mechanisms to let us know something directly at the FAA, but in a healthy company, that should also be happening within the company.
Were they discouraging it earlier?
If there were evidence of that would lead to direct action. I'm not here to make an accusation like that at this time. If anything, we want you to err on the side of reporting. So that's the encouraging part. The concerning part, of course, is that any of those issues are happening at all.
Right.
And that's why Boeing is under a huge amount of scrutiny right now, including from the FAA. The administrator took the extraordinary step of saying that Boeing cannot increase their production until they've demonstrated that they can do it safely.
That FAA decision also goes with it, that 90-day timeline and report that Boeing has to hand in.
That ends more or less right at the end of May. So we're coming up on the period where Boeing will put forward their plan. FAA will assess it, then begins a process of accountability, monitoring, making sure they're conforming to that plan and that it's getting the results that it should.
That doesn't sound like that moves quickly. I mean, the FAA administrator was on another network this week and said Boeing has a long road ahead to improve safety. How quickly is this going to move?
Yeah, there needs to be some major change, and that's not overnight work. Now, to be clear, if there were an immediate safety issue, anytime there is, FAA acts immediately. It's why it took the extraordinary step of grounding, for example, all of those 737 MAX 9 aircraft until they could be specifically inspected and returned to service.
So that hold is not going to be lifted next week when this report is turned in. That's what it sounds like.
They're going to have to do more to demonstrate their readiness to safely increase production. And again, obviously the goal is for them to do so, but only on a safe and healthy basis.
I want to ask you about something that we hear quite a lot about on the campaign trail, and that is electric cars, electric vehicles. Donald Trump repeatedly talks about President Biden's decision to force the industry towards making 56% of car batteries electric by 2032, 13% hybrid. Listen to what he said in New Jersey recently.
Do you notice he's trying to save the electrical vehicle, but not the gas-powered, which is the vehicle that everybody wants. They're going crazy with the electric car, costing us a fortune. We're spending hundreds of billions of dollars subsidizing a car that nobody wants and nobody's ever going to buy.
He's not wrong.
Oh, he's
on
wrong.
The purchasing. He's not. Of the 4 million vehicles purchased, 269,000 electric vehicles were sold in the U.S. market. It's up like 2%.
Every single year, more Americans buy EVs than the year. Well,
aren't
this
we
is really
seeing it move
important.
more quickly?
Every single year, more Americans buy EVs than the year prior. There are two things that I think are needed for that to happen even more quickly. One is the price, which is why the Inflation Reduction Act acted to cut the price of an electric vehicle. The second is making sure we have the charging network we need across America. But I want to talk about the bigger point here. And I take this very personally because I grew up in the industrial Midwest, literally in the shadow of broken down factories from car companies that did not survive into the turn of the century because they didn't keep up with the times.
And many of those auto workers are concerned that electric vehicles require fewer humans to manufacture.
The most important thing is that the EV revolution will happen with or without us, and we've got to make sure that it's American-led. And that's what the president is focused on. We don't want China. Look, under the Trump administration, they allowed China to build an advantage in the EV industry. But under President Biden's leadership, we're making sure that the EV revolution will be a made-in-America EV revolution that is
because of these tariffs
critically
you're
important.
talking about that President Biden says he's going to roll
Also,
out.
just making sure we invest in America's capacity, making sure that we are onshoring or friend-shoring the materials and the processing of what goes into these EVs, making sure that America masters these processes. Because look, there's no way that we're going to get to the middle of this century with the technology that we counted on a century ago. Now, there are obviously a lot of voices here in Washington who are interested in keeping the status quo.
He says it's going to be one of the first things he does.
Would
if
be
he's
happy
reelected.
to see Americans trapped with dirty and expensive fuels. But the reality, and I know he's made a lot of promises to the oil and gas CEOs about some of the favors that he believes
But
his
it
administration
obviously is
will deliver
resonating
them.
for him because he wouldn't bring it up so frequently if there wasn't some anxiety that he's tapping into. And let me ask you about a portion of this that I think does fall under your portfolio, and that's the charging stations you mentioned. The Federal Highway Administration says only 7 or 8 charging stations have been produced with a $7.5 billion investment that taxpayers made back in 2021. Why isn't that happening more quickly?
So the president's goal is to have 500,000 chargers up by the end of this decade. Now, in order to do a charger, it's more than just plunking a small device into the ground. There's utility work, and this is also really a new category of federal investment. But we've been working with each of the 50 states. Every one of them is getting formula dollars to do this work,
7 or 8,
engaging them
though?
in the first handful. Again, by 2030, 500,000 chargers. And the very first handful of chargers are now already being physically built. But again, that's the absolute very, very beginning stages of the construction to come. The reason that we're investing federal dollars is to fill in some of the gaps in areas where it is not yet profitable for the private sector to do it. Now, again, the majority of charging will happen at home. And in some senses, an electric vehicle has more in common. Fueling it has more in common with charging your phone than it does with filling up a gas car in ways that are both helpful and challenging. But that is exactly the transition that America is going through right now. And the other thing, again, is the price, right? We have seen the cost of EVs fall to now where it's within a few percent of an equivalent gas car. Depending on the model, you may come out ahead now.
Secretary Buttigieg, thank you for your insights today.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back. For an update on efforts to secure our elections, we're joined now by CBS News election law contributor David Becker, the founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, and CBS News national security contributor Sam Vinograd, who is a top counterterrorism official at the Department of Homeland Security. Good to have you both here. I want to start with you, David. We talked last week and we'll continue to talk about election security and integrity. And we know that top officials have testified to Congress that election infrastructure has never been more secure. But there are a lot of buts in this environment we're going into. One specific example, Republican activists in at least 3 states now, where Donald Trump tried to reverse his defeat in 2020, nearly all of them under criminal indictment, are now poised to reprise a role in the upcoming election. As presidential electors. This is all Washington Post reporting. What does that mean for the integrity of the events they are directly going to be involved with?
Yeah, as you noted, the 2020 election was an incredible success with regard to election security. Higher turnout than we've ever seen before, in the middle of a global pandemic, and that work has withstood the highest scrutiny we've ever seen in any election for now over 3.5 years.
Not a single. Challenges.
Yeah, exactly. No evidence in any court of any problem. And yet we remember going back to Detroit in 2020, attacks on counting centers. There were efforts to organize fake electors, which are being litigated, and criminal charges have been brought in many states. There were efforts to fail to certify elections, to give legal effect to elections in places like Arizona and New Mexico, and just earlier this month in Michigan. And it is likely that we will see efforts like that by supporters of losing candidates in November of 2020 and afterwards. That's troubling. These are legal duties that people have to certify elections, particularly when legal challenges have not been successful. But that said, I think election officials all over the country are ready for that in many ways, just like they were in elections since 2020. They were ready for it in Arizona when it happened, in New Mexico when it happened, and just earlier this month in Michigan, election officials in the state quickly required that county to act and certify the elections. So We will expect that there will be efforts to slow down, delay, or even attack the counting, auditing, and certification process, perhaps, in the last 2 months of 2024. Yeah. But I'm cautiously optimistic that election officials are ready to keep that moving on track so that electors can be ascertained on December 11th, meet on December 17th, and be counted on January 6th.
So, Sam, you were in the administration until recently. Spreading lies about candidates is not illegal. It is protected free speech. But what David's talking about poses a threat at the state level, and it's states that run these elections. How concerned are you, and whose job is it to set the record straight?
Well, Margaret, just because speech is protected by the First Amendment does not mean that it's cost-free. We know that in today's threat environment, disinformation is unfortunately becoming the norm rather than the exception when it comes to election security. And it's having a direct impact. We know that there's been an unprecedented level of physical threats arising out of election-related disinformation. January 6th is just one example. The Department of Justice's Election Threats Task Force has made 17 arrests, 13 convictions in their ongoing investigations. And when election-related disinformation spreads, every American needs to understand that does give a benefit to our adversaries, Russia and China, who want to sow discord and undermine our democratic processes. Americans should be confident in our election infrastructure security, but our information ecosystem remains incredibly vulnerable. And the federal government is not and should not be the omnipresent fact checker for the American people. The federal government is undergoing rigorous processes to debunk specific inaccurate information about elections, as are state and local state board of elections. At the same time, social media companies should be thinking about what kinds of election disinformation violate their terms of service. And every American, frankly, has a patriotic duty to engage in additional security checks when it comes to the information that they are digesting and sharing. Americans lock their doors, we wear our seatbelts, we take security precautions in other domains, and we need to apply that same rigor to our information ecosystem for our national security and physical security as well.
No, we put a lot on the electorate to keep themselves informed, and certainly here we will try to be fact-checking, but there is so much disinformation, misinformation sometimes, but a lot of it's deliberate. I want to ask you, David, Speaker Johnson told reporters earlier this week he knew intuitively that non-U.S. citizens had been voting in the elections. He said it's not easily proven, but he issued a statement saying Russian spies, Chinese diplomats, and illegal aliens are influencing the election. How does an election official certify that someone is a U.S. citizen when they come to vote?
There are multiple protections around this. First, it is against the law. There is a federal statute, 18 U.S. Code, Section 611, that says it's unlawful, up to a year in jail and fines for a non-citizen that votes. In addition, under the Help America Vote Act, which has been in place for over 2 decades, every single registered voter needs to provide ID before registering. And that ID is almost always a driver's license number, which is checked against the motor vehicles file. And when you go to motor vehicles, you know you need to show legal presence. Most people show a birth certificate from the United States or a passport, which shows that they're citizens. That can be checked against that.
If they don't have that.
If they don't have that, they can provide a social security number, which is also checked, or they have to provide ID at the polls before they vote. So there's absolute ID for voter registration, and we know these two protections have been enormously successful because this is knowable, despite what the speaker might have said. Georgia, for instance, ran an audit of their entire voter registration system. They found about 1,500 people that they couldn't confirm whether they were citizens or not, and determined that literally 0 of them had voted. Same with other states have done similar things. The data is all in the state databases. They can check it. We can be very confident that voting by non-citizens is extremely rare, virtually non-existent. Not 0 probably, but very close to 0.
Sam, how much planning is the federal government doing going into this election when we know there may be perhaps even violent disagreement?
Well, I do want to emphasize it's not just the federal government. Federal, state, and local officials are engaged in a range of contingency planning for various threat scenarios, whether that be deepfake circulating that could impact voter suppression, for example. We saw attempts at that in New Hampshire, or whether it's actual physical security incidents coming out of election results. The federal government, with its state and local partners, is engaged in contingency planning for physical security threats and other threats that could impact the elections and its aftermath.
It is good to have both of you here to fact check, and we will stay on it, as you indicated, Sam, part of our duty as well. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you all for watching. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.